Well, hey folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Hit buttons and do things. Uh, this may be a bit more than I actually want to chew, but I'm going to go through my favorite 20 classic pre-5th edition D&D books that you can get in print through Drivethrurpg still. I'm going to try to run through them fairly quickly. I'm going to give like a little bit of my reasoning of why these are in my top 20. And I'm kind of going from, there's no specifically hammered down order on these. Some of them are kind of organized into chunks because of how they interrelate to each other, but roughly from like lowest of the 20 to top of the 20. So you want to stick around to the end so you can see what I say is the best classic D&D supplement of all time. But we're going to start off, and we're going to get the two 4th edition books that I have on this little list here out of the way first. So first I'm going to start off with Heroes of the Feywild. I include this because, the Feywild and the Shadowfell are both interesting ideas that were, kind of introduced by 4th edition. And there's, unfortunately, I felt like there wasn't a lot of, specific material to describe exactly what the Feywild was all about. This book, while not, focused on world information, as it's a player's guide for playing Feywild characters, it does have some amount in there towards the back, and enough material spread throughout it, just in terms of what players need to know in order for them to understand the environment they're from, that as a DM you can harvest it and find ways to use it. But I mean, it's a 4th edition product, so I mean, if you want to use it for 5th edition, I mean, it's mostly compatible, but there are some tweaks that need to be made. Probably pairs well with the Witchlight adventure module they just put out. I'm guessing, I haven't actually had a chance to read it, but from what I know about the races and stuff they've included, and that kind of fills in some gaps that were in here. Also, bringing in satyrs from Mythic Odysseys of Pharaohs could, help flesh this out for a 5th edition version. But, like I said, at least it does have some minimal world information on exactly what the Feywild is like and what you can find there, which you can use. And the other thing I'm going to put up here for 4th edition, I would have included Vorrukoth, but I haven't been able to find that in print in forever. That is Hammerfast. It's a quick and dirty, simple little campaign starting point with some adventure ideas. It's basically a little dwarf town in the mountains that's haunted, and so they kind of have to cohabitate with ghosts in a somewhat peaceful fashion. Lots of competing dwarf guilds and mountainous adventures and all that kind of stuff. An interesting dragon villain, and it's just just in terms of just a simple little starting point. It's not bad and is easily adaptable to other versions of D&D, since it's mostly just describing the town and the people you find there. You can easily plug in stats from other versions of the books, or just make a few tweaks to modify it so that it matches the edition of D&D that you're going for. So with that out of the way, there's a trio of Forgotten Realms books I'm going to include in here. I'm not the biggest fan of Forgotten Realms. I kind of avoided it up until 5th edition had so heavily wed itself to the Forgotten Realms setting that I finally just kind of had to shrug and give in and finally delve in to the whole thing. My complaint with Forgotten Realms is it's part of that classic 4 core D&D settings that I just felt was just a little too derivative of Tolkien's universe. I prefer D&D settings that are, and fantasy role-playing game settings in general that are a little bit more I guess original, may or may not be the right word, but or offer something different than just, we got a halfling, a dwarf, and an elf, and a human on a merry little quest to go fight the Goblin King. But there are a trio of Forgotten Realms books that I do like, all of which are not included on the big Faerun map that 5th edition kind of is based around. Although a couple of them are at least hinted at. One of which, Elves of Evermeet, as just a contained setting. If you want to run an all-elf game, it's pretty cool. And if you include some of the lore that they've had come through with 5th edition of how Evermeet's now kind of straddling both the Forgotten Realms world and also touching Aboria in the Outer Realms, Outer Planes, and also like bridges to the Feywild. Kind of gives it you ability to like to further detach it from Forgotten Realms, and like I said, it could just be kind of a self-contained all elf type of setting where all the different types of elves are included and stuff. You know, since this was written, you know, obviously this is not around the time where they had Eladrin or Shadar Kai, but you know, with a little bit of thought, a creative DM should be able to take the information in this and just advance the timeline forward to match where it is in 4th or 5th edition or whatever edition that you want to use the rules for. Kalamport. Possibly one of my favorite city settings of any D&D product. It's different. I like how the city... It's cool if you like Thieves Guild and Magic Guild and like, you know, different, you know, rival city at war with itself kind of a thing going on. The way the city is subdivided with all these walls and walkways where like the richer, higher classes like never actually set foot on the ground level. And you know, like the various wards that control the character and nature of the different parts of the cities. It's very intricate and interesting, and like, you know, I don't know, just gives you something more interesting, I feel, than what you get with Baldur's Gate or Waterdeep or Neverwinter. And the last of the Forgotten Realms books that I'm going to mention in this list is Dreams of the Red Wizards, which gives you a little brief tour of the Kingdom of Thay, which, as you know, as I purport in some of my videos, my belief that the more stable D&D civilizations would probably be the lawful evil ones. Like, well, this is one of the rare examples of an actual lawful evil kingdom setting with maps and NPCs, and you know, once again, fairly easy to translate over to whatever D&D edition you want, even though it's I believe it's a 2nd edition D&D supplement. So that gets us out of Forgotten Realms. Like I say, I know a lot of you out there are fans of Forgotten Realms, and I dig it. I don't hate it. It's not like it's not like it's Dragonlance, which is not on my list at all. Or even Greyhawk, which is like, it's cool, but it's also kind of boring all these years later. But the other of the core standard D&D settings of old that I do like is Mystara. And because of that, one of the few core rule books I'm including on this list, I'm going to include the Rules Cyclopedia for the original, you know, basic through advanced box sets that were all compiled into one big rule book. It's clunky. This version of D&D is very clunky and arguably broken, especially at higher levels. But the book itself, beyond just giving you a brief overview of Mystara and a bunch of maps and whatnot for the whole world, it just has a ton of like just little like resources that never really got redone in other editions, or at least not done with a lot of justice, that are real easy to like pull out and plug in to another version of D&D. That's why I personally advocate for running 0th edition D&D, where you'll choose, you know, like whichever edition you're most comfortable with for the basic core mechanics and for the character creation and for the leveling. But other than that, you know, pulling setting stuff and character stuff and NPCs and stuff and other kinds of side rules from any D&D edition you want. They all basically run on the same principles, even all these years later. And so there's a ton of stuff in this book that you can use for any D&D game. So I highly recommend it. And to go along with that, like I say, I actually rather do like Mystara. It's more human focused. It gets kind of wonky when you get to the high level stuff, because then you get into the fact that it kind of has a different kind of mythology going on, where, you know, characters can literally become immortals and become godlike beings that are, you know, in an almost Mage the Ascension kind of style. Their immortality is drawn from like one of the basic essential core forces that power reality, kind of a thing. But it does have some interesting setting stuff. Right off the bat, I'm going to say Shadow Elves, way more interesting than the Menzo Benzeran, Drow, Dark Elves. These is a different kind of underground dwelling, quote-unquote, dark elf that, I don't know, just for whatever reason, I find them preferable in how they're presented and their outlook on life. I mean, they're sinister in their own ways, and they got their own kind of strange mythology going on as to why they've gone underground and stayed underground. But I find them a little less like Saturday morning cartoonish than how Drizzt and the Drow and Forgotten Realms run. So, but you can't really do the Shadow Elves without dealing with what lies above the Shadow Elves. Unfortunately, they don't have the book for the Orcs for Mystara in print, at least not the last time I looked, but part of their underground realm also does touch upon the principalities of Glantry, which is, like one of the great Magic Kingdom settings that D&D's ever produced. It's fantastic. It's an interesting society and the way that they've kind of justified why Magic users are in charge. Pardon. And, with all the stuff about, Strixhaven coming out and them acting like, oh my God, what a new innovative thing, a setting that has a magic college and characters can play, magicians learning to be magicians. Well, this already had this, and this is like, what, 35 years old? 30 years old? I'm not quite sure the year this one came out. Sometime in the very early 90s or late 80s, I want to say, though. So, yeah, maybe not quite as original as y'all think. But kind of low-key my favorite of the various old, D&D basic books is the Creature Crucible for the Sea People. Like a lot of D&D touches on undersea settings without actually really getting, pun intended, deep into, like what an actual undersea setting would look like. Well, this is, one of your few really, really good examples. And because of that, it's easily liftable and translatable to other D&D editions. Also, Goodman Games, I didn't include any of the Goodman game reboots of adventures that they put out because they're technically not classic D&D books anymore. However, if in particular, if you have or want to use the Goodman Games version of the Isle of Dread, this is actually a really good book to have to supplement that, because this basically is describing the undersea inhabitants and lands under the water that you can find around those islands. So it's worth picking up for that. Now, getting out of D&D's more generic settings for now, I'm going to mention my favorite Spelljammer setting, which is the Astra Mundi cluster. Now, this was a box set, but you can get it printed up as a book on Drivethrurpg. And just because of that, I should have to make honorable mention that, like, in order to be able to use any Spelljammer stuff, you're kind of dependent on having a copy of the original Spelljammer box set material. But I feel like this does a better job. Unlike standard Spelljammer, which just kind of attaches to whichever other D&D setting you're already using or familiar with, this actually gives an entire self-contained Spelljammer setting all within one solar system that does, it just does interesting things with the lore. And you got 4 different human civilizations. There's this Beholder Kingdom. The Dennithes are treated massively different to a point where, they may not be good guys, but you can at least negotiate with them. There's a good amount of focus on the space elves and on lizard people in space. And it's a great resource. Like I said, it takes the basic concepts of Spelljammer and actually builds its own original setting for Spelljammer out of it. Also has some additional starship designs for Spelljammer, which are among some of my favorites. Also, it's a good location where you can actually put the Spelljammer floating around somewhere on the outer edge of the solar system. It's got stuff about constellations, which I thought was an interesting addition that, for that style of classic fantasy sci-fi. And going along with that, of the various, old AD&D character handbooks, just because it's really useful for Spelljammer, but also just like a really good example of them in general, I'm going to throw the Complete Spacefarer's Handbook into this mix. Just, as a player character and a game master resource, it's extremely supplemental. You can probably run Spelljammer with just these 2 books and 5th edition. We just kind of use this as like a guideline for introducing some of the other races. The Spelljammer features. Okay. Dark Sun, the original Dark Sun box set. It speaks for itself. It's one of the most badass D&D settings ever made. I may not personally be a fan of where they decide to take the meta plot of Dark Sun, but if you just go back to the original box set and ignore all that stuff with the Prism Pentad, you still get a pretty goddamn solid RPG experience. I personally feel it bolts into 5th edition not too badly. The biggest problem about running Dark Sun nowadays, if you're a print book person, is getting a hold of a hard copy of the Psyonix Handbook. Last time I had checked, Drivethrurpg did not still have that one available for print, only as PDF. And unfortunately, Psyonix are such a key critical component to the Dark Sun setting that without the Psyonix Handbook, you're kind of stuck. And that's probably where you get the biggest kind of conversion issues if you're trying to take the material in this and make it a 5th edition campaign setting, is you're kind of forced to have to strip most of the psionics out of it, at least the way they're presented back in the day. I mean, some spell effects and whatnot, have psionic style ability, but they're not built the same way that the old psionics skill system kind of was. Another core rule book that I'm including in here, and it might be a bit of a surprise, but it's the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. I mean, yeah, the magic items for 4th edition probably should have been in this book. For the purposes of 4th edition adventure design, I feel like this is did one of the best jobs out of any of the DMGs at actually laying out the mechanics of what you need to put in an adventure so that characters can level up by the end of that adventure. But the reason why I'm including this in this list is it actually provides my favorite generic D&D setting for a Tolkien-style, just standard D&D world, and that's the Nentir Vale, which is described in the back of this book. I found it simple, self-contained, and a great environment the characters can bounce around in between starting to mid-tier level before they get to a point where they're able to start, exploring the Omniverse and all that kind of shit. And if there's one lament I have about 5th edition is that they dropped the Nentir Vale as the standard setting and instead wedded 5th edition to Forgotten Realms in place of it. Albeit 5th edition still carries over a lot of 4th editions, like the basic mix of player character races and all that kind of stuff. I like the Nentir Vale, and because of that you can still use it, and this book provides a good description of it all, as well as for the town of Fallcrest. Okay, a generic book that's just good for AD&D, and also is a good resource just for designing NPCs for other editions of D&D, even if the specific statting as presented in this book doesn't necessarily translate perfectly to other editions, would be the book for Sages and Specialists. Also, if you are using the old 2nd edition AD&D rules, it's an interesting opportunity to have kind of like a lower dex version of a D&D game where if all the players are playing these kinds of characters instead of the classic hero set of classes from the player's handbook, I think could provide for an interesting and alternative take on the D&D world. Now we're going to get into Planescape. I got a couple of Planescape books here. Another honorable mention, like the Spelljammer box set. In order to be able to properly use any Planescape product from the 90s, you want to have a hold of the basic box set, which once again Drivethrurpg does just print the whole thing up as one big book. But I'm going to start off the best section of the Planes, in my opinion, Planes of Chaos. Several of them are, I'd say, your most approachable for a new group of characters in a Planescape setting. Also, if you were to take the sections in this about Arborea and then mix it up with Mythic Odysseys of Theros, I think you'd get a much more interesting version of, the Olympus realm than what you get with Mythic Odysseys of Theros, which is why not just go ahead and set it in Greece with Greek gods? This would allow you to mix those two together and have Theros just be set in the Arborea dimension. So on that, and like I said, it's for starting level Planescape characters, these are probably the planes that you want them going to at first. The Player's Guide to Sigil. I mean, like, you know, do you want to use Sigil in your campaigns? I mean, here it is. It's got maps. It's got like a lot of references to like a lot of primary gates, so you can kind of start to work out your own little chart of what leads where and where in the city people might need to go. Lots of information on the various factions. It's pretty essential and is still very much usable and useful since Sigil still remains in the 5th edition setting. Kind of on a side note, before I get any further, while we're in the Planescape section of my little list here, you know, yes, 5th edition as its core starting world, using Forgotten Realms, you know, from like most of their adventure modules. I actually wouldn't argue, though, that 5th edition is Forgotten Realms. I mean, obviously there's other settings out there, but 5th edition still brings in so much stuff from Planescape that I would kind of venture out there that 5th edition really is just Planescape. All they've done is removed the Outlands, but Sigil is still there. You know, the wheel is still there. I mean, it's all intact. The inclusion of the Feywild and the Shadowfell does kind of like warble the cosmology a little bit, but not too terribly. So yeah, but anyway, my last Planescape book I'm going to include is the Planewalker's Handbook, which arguably, at least from the player character usefulness, gives you like all the stuff that the basic Planescape box set gives you, but you know, it honed down and told in a more practical fashion. It's got a lot of interesting kits, a lot of information on the factions, and descriptions on how all this interplanar nonsense works. And yeah, it's one of my favorites. We're getting up to the last three, the top 3 D&D books. I'm going to include the broken-ass Council of Worms. I mean, it's a broken setting. It's unfinished. I mean, even the maps were like mislabeled apparently in the book. And the attempt to try to make player character dragons is still like it's arguable whether or not it was successful or not. However, in terms of like interesting dragon lore that you can draw on for like your own homebrew settings, it's pretty cool. As the basis to make a homebrew setting, it's pretty cool. The dragons as player characters probably does not translate easily to 5th edition, but you can get copies of the 2nd edition rule books on Drivethrurpg that would allow you to run a functional Council of Worms campaign. I kind of like it because it's unfinished, and also because the fuck-ups in it kind of are, it's a nice humanizing reminder that, you know, even the professionals are a bunch of like amateurish idiots just like the rest of us. So, you know, it just makes you feel good knowing that at the peak of TSR's publishing strength in the 90s, that they would, you know, cram out something that this was just snuck right by them, like that they got the names on the islands switched around as badly as they did. And yeah, it's a weird thing to like, and it's a weird thing to make it a top tier book in my estimation. But, you know, I like that it's broken because it gives you something to do if you're trying to create a runnable adventure in it. All right, I haven't had very many adventure modules in here, if any, at this point, really. But I am going to include what is my favorite classic AD&D adventure module, The Day of Al-Akbar. It's almost like an Al-Qadim Light, all in one book. It's set for like 10th level characters, so that gives you actually a tremendous amount of room for foreshadowing to build a campaign that leads up to this. I know people have raised issue with the cover, and they can go to hell. It's a badass cover. It's also kind of a radically different ending for, you know, a big D&D adventure. You know, you're most of them, you know, like the cover is kind of depicting the end scene, and this is as much doing that as, you know, any other D&D book. So I don't know. I recommend it. I like it. Finally, the most useful, universally useful, I find, D&D supplement you can get your hands on is Dennithes. You want a realistic and detailed Thieves Guild? This provides one that's already written up, or you can use it as, you know, just like a guideline to then plug in your own PCs within it. You can translate to pretty much any city setting and pretty much any D&D world where you want a Thieves Guild that's more than just, you know, a guy in a bar giving out thief missions and gold. This gives you all the different kinds of rackets and types of NPCs that might be working for a Thieves Guild and all that kind of stuff. I can't recommend this highly enough. And as I'm saying, this is the number one. I mean, without any question, this is what I consider to be the most useful classic D&D sourcebook of all time. And that's it. I guess this has probably gone on long enough. I know I'm sick of it. So thanks for sticking around this long. Words and description box. And like I said, hit buttons and all that kind of stuff. Stay waspinated. And happy Hanukkah.